I wanted to thank the members of the audience who have come to be here first thing in the morning. We really, really appreciate that you are here. This is the Stanford Interdisciplinary Conference on Conscience, as you all know, and it's been a huge, huge pleasure to work on, and we're very excited that the participants have come from all over the country through bad weather, through nor'easters, through sandy aftermath, all kinds of things, elections, to be here. So thank you so much for making the trip and being at the table. I'm about to introduce our organizing faculty member, Nancy Ruttenberg, but before I do, I wanted to see if we can go around the U-shaped table and just give a brief introduction of yourself. Let us know your names. I know that we have signs, but the audience members are not able to see the signs, so let's just hear a name and where you come from, where you're flying in from, or what your affiliation is, so that we can know who we're speaking to. So let's start with Andrew.
I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm from Rutgers. I have come from Sandy and the Nor'easter, both, and I'll be speaking in a few minutes, so I won't say anything else. Thank you.
I'm Mark Valeri. I teach at Union Seminary in Richmond, Virginia.
I'm Jack Rakove. I teach history and political science here at Stanford.
I'm Hannah Walser. I'm a grad student here in the English department who's working on organizing this.
I'm Fadi Judah. I live in Houston. I'm a physician and a poet and a translator of poetry.
Good morning. I'm Steve Kleinman. I come all the way from Monterey, California. No storms stop me. Traffic jam, but no storms. I'm here as a member of the United States Air Force, and I'm a career intelligence officer.
Carolyn Winterer. I teach early American history in the history department at Stanford. I'm on the first panel.
I'm Steve Knapp here from Washington, D.C. I'm from George Washington University, where I'm in the administration now. My field is English literature.
Mark Johnson. I'm in the philosophy department at the University of Oregon.
Anne Aguio. I'm a filmmaker, and I came from Sandy in the Northeast.
Michael Perry, Emory University, Atlanta.
Kent Greenewald from law school at Columbia, and I came on a beautiful day from New York, one of the rare ones we've had in the last week or so.
Eyal Press. I also came from New York, but left Sunday, fortunately. I'm a visiting fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU, and a writer and journalist.
Great, thank you so much. And then we have other panelists who are going to be arriving as they can. There have been all kinds of delays. One thing was that for those of you sitting on the wings, can you hear the panelists at the table? I wondered. So for those of you, we have mics, and we have actually two people to a mic on the table. And I wanted to ask you guys to perhaps, when you speak, make sure that you're at least speaking toward the mic, that perhaps you draw the mic toward you if it's out at the edge of the table, so that it picks up your voice, because we don't want you to get drowned out. All right, so without further ado, let me introduce Nancy Ruttenberg, the organizer and mastermind of this conference. Nancy Ruttenberg is the William Robertson Cove Professor of American Literature in English in the English department at Stanford. She also holds courtesy appointments in the Department of Comparative Literature and the Department of Slavic Literature, Languages and Literatures, and directs the Center for the Study of the Novel. She's held teaching positions at Harvard, Berkeley, and most recently NYU, where she was chair of the Department of Comparative Literature from 2002 to 2008. She's been the recipient of numerous awards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a National Humanities Center Fellowship, a University of California President's Research Fellowship, and the American Council for Learned Societies. Her research focuses on the intersection of political, religious, and literary expression in the colonial through antebellum America and 19th century Russia, with a particular focus on the development of liberal and non-liberal forms of democratic subjectivity. She's the author of Democratic Personality, Popular Voice, and the Trial of American Authorship, published by Stanford University Press, and Dostoevsky's Democracy, published by Princeton University Press in 2008. Her current book projects include Dostoevsky and, a comparative work that explores the literature of American modernity through the lens of Dostoevsky's work, and Conscience, Rights, and the Delirium of Democracy, a study of secularization in the post-revolutionary United States arising out of the naturalization of conscience as an inalienable right. Please welcome Nancy Ruttenberg.
Well, thank you, Lucy, and thank you, let me repeat Lucy's thanks for all of you being here. I know from having been in communication with many of the panelists what some of you have been through, and I appreciate very much the fact that you're here. People from the Northeast in particular, I was trying to think, what could possibly motivate them? And I thought, well, you know, maybe it's a desire to come to the conference. Maybe they thought it would be nice to be in California, where the worst thing that can happen to you is an earthquake. And, you know, it's not, earthquakes are scary, but they're not wet. So I think that this is, might be what motivated some people to work so hard to be here. I'll speak in a minute about my own motivations for putting this conference together, an interdisciplinary conference on conscience, but first let me say that to make it happen required the dedication of many of my Stanford colleagues, and I'd like to thank them for their ongoing support of this event. First, Amir Eshel, and maybe as I thank you, you can stand up so people know who you are. Amir Eshel, director of the Europe Center, who responded with such enthusiasm when I ran the possibility of this conference by him almost 2 years ago, and who provided our first and extremely generous co-sponsorship, giving us credibility with other co-sponsors. I don't think we could have gotten this conference off the ground without Amir's help. So thank you, Amir. Second, I'd like to thank Karen Haley and Roland Shu, the Program and Fellowship Coordinator and Associate Director of the Europe Center, respectively, who together carried out the very complicated work of administering an interdisciplinary conference, and they did so with unfailing good cheer. So Roland, I see Karen standing in the back in the red scarf, and Roland, where are you? Roland is not here. Karen in particular has been in touch with me or my two assistants on a daily basis, and many other people besides, to make sure that the diabolically complicated wheels and gears of the conference planning machine ran smoothly. And she did so with a twinkle, maybe a tear or two in her eyes. Third, it's no exaggeration to say that we wouldn't be sitting here this morning if it weren't for Lucy Alford, and everybody knows who Lucy is, and Hannah Walser. Hannah, could you just raise a hand or stand up? Who through their extraordinary efforts made the conference happen. They built it brick by brick. Had they known ahead of time that they'd be doing so, I think that common sense would have led them to decline graciously but firmly. Lucy Alford holds a doctorate in modern thought from the University of Aberdeen, Scotland, and is currently a doctoral candidate in comparative literature at Stanford. She's accompanied me from the first in the work of conceptualizing and organizing the conference, and very importantly for me, she endorsed it as a worthwhile thing to do. So thank you, Lucy. Hannah Walser is a doctoral candidate in English who joined Lucy last summer in making the conference a reality and quickly made herself indispensable, even though she's preparing for her qualifying exams, and with Lucy is helping to run the Center for the Study of the Novel. I've been extremely fortunate to have Hannah and Lucy with me every step of the way. Finally, let me thank our generous Stanford co-sponsors, the Europe Center, the Stanford Arts Institute, the former Dean of the Law School, Larry Kramer, the Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences, Richard Saller, the Associate Dean for the Humanities and Arts, Deborah Satz, the Stanford Creative Writing Program, the Stanford Humanities Center, the Taub Center for Jewish Studies, the Department of English, the Division of Literatures, Cultures, and Languages, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society, the Department of Art and Art History, the Department of History, and the Department of Philosophy. So we had a truly interdisciplinary group supporting this conference. To give us a sense of what we're dealing with when we try to comprehend conscience in post-Reformation modernity, to give us a sense of this, let me begin with a couple of citations. The first is taken from the 1596 treatise, What Conscience Is, written by the influential Anglican theologian William Perkins, who had a particular influence on American colonial Calvinists. This is William Perkins. Conscience is of a divine nature and is a thing placed of God in the midst between him and man, as an arbitrator to give sentence and to pronounce either with man or against man unto God. And hence comes one reason of the name of conscience, scire, to know is of one man alone by himself, and conscire is when two at the least know some one secret thing, either of them knowing it together with the other. Therefore the name conscientia. Conscience is that thing that combines two together and makes them partners in the knowledge of one and the same secret. Now man and man, or man and angel, cannot be combined, because they cannot know the secret of any man unless it be revealed to them. It remains, therefore, that this combination is only between man and God. God knows perfectly all the doings of man, though they be never so hid and concealed. And man, by a gift given him of God, knows together with God the same things of himself, and this gift is named conscience. So let that be one bookend for this conference. And I say bookend because the history of conscience in post-Reformation modernity is tremendously complex and has generated analysis and commentary across the range of scholarly disciplines and in public discourse. So let this second citation from Saul Bellow's novel Herzog be the closing bookend. Bellow, you'll be happy to hear, is more concise than Perkins. Perhaps that's an indication of a lack of certainty about what we're dealing with. Bellow's title character, Herzog, has just discovered that his wife and best friend are having an affair. And this is what he says. Conscience, there's a word for you. Conscience is historically such a vast subject that I had to circumscribe it in organizing the conference so that it could be accommodated in 2 days. As you can see, I chose the Protestant Reformation as a starting point because the individual relationship with God it promoted generated the proliferation of antinomian sects, which in turn led to the secularization of conscience. An important touchstone for me of this process was the transformation of conscience conceived as God's law, indelibly inscribed on the human heart, into conscience conceived as an inalienable natural right, a prerogative of the self-possessed individual. These two conceptions could not be more antithetical, and both had enduring political implications. So my first reason for organizing this interdisciplinary conference was to examine the transition in the meaning of conscience, a transition which I believe from the available evidence is incomplete. Collectively, I feel, we're situated on a continuum of religious to secular at a point where for us, conscience is experienced as an imperfectly amalgamated mixture of incompatible elements. An example of the available evidence I refer to might be simply the frequency with which one hears secular people in everyday conversation invoking their consciences as if they were backed by a transcendent authority in which those people don't believe. All of us still seem to be situated betwixt and between. As a scholar of American colonial through antebellum literature and culture, I have to confess that I only recently discovered that the inalienable and natural right to conscience is not guaranteed by the First Amendment. It's like losing your virginity. I was astonished and went around for a while asking other people if they knew that. For the most part, people just shrugged. They didn't know if they knew, and they didn't care that they didn't know if they knew. But my own sense of shock led me to wonder why I had assumed it was there. After a bit of looking into the matter in a scholarly realm outside my expertise, literature, I attributed my assumption to the fact that at some point in the late 17th century, the discourse of conscience as a divinely imposed obligation and the discourse of human rights as natural and inalienable, two discourses which had developed on parallel tracks, began to converge. It was just a matter of time before someone, and it seems to have been John Locke in his 1689 letter concerning toleration, would acknowledge this, this convergence and the consequent sea change in the meaning of conscience by stating that, and I quote, "Liberty of conscience is every man's natural right." Now, I realize that the right to which Locke refers is the liberty of conscience and not conscience itself, but that distinction, among others, is a slippery one, which is itself difficult to pin down. So where are we now? Somewhere between conscience as divine mandate and conscience as human prerogative. Why was conscience, after appearing in, I think, Jack Rakoff can tell us, every draft of the First Amendment, elided from the final draft? Perhaps because at some level the founders recognized that conscience contained two ideologically incompatible meanings whose enjambment disallowed its translation into the language of the law. My second reason for organizing this conference, and there's only two, so don't worry, had to do with my work on Dostoevsky. I am, by degree and inclination, a comparatist whose second field is 19th century Russian literature and culture. In 2008, I published Dostoevsky's Democracy, which gives an account of the novelist's first real contact with Russian peasants in the Siberian forced labor camp, where ironically he was sent for his participation in a radical student group who were agitating for peasant emancipation. In 1861, when he returned to Russia after a decade in Siberia, he wrote a fictionalized autobiography of his experience in the camp entitled Notes from the House of the Dead, which I consider crucial for understanding the development of Russia's non-liberal concept of populist democracy. In my book, I argue that House of the Dead is the first of Dostoevsky's great novels. Typically, Crime and Punishment, published in 1866, is considered the first. Because in House of the Dead, he begins an examination of the linked mysteries of crime, conscience, and consciencelessness, which will extend across the great novels to culminate in the Brothers Karamazov. More specifically, in Notes from the House of the Dead, Dostoevsky begins to investigate the circumstances under which an individual or a political group or a state might come to believe and act on the proposition that, quote, everything is permitted. Across the novels, he applies more and more pressure to that hypothesis and its enactments in personal and political life, which are central to all his novels' plots. So Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment wonders if for certain extraordinary people, like Napoleon, everything is permitted, but not for the ordinary mass of people. And he tries to determine whether or not he is one of the extraordinary by murdering two old women. The novel records his failure to prove himself extraordinary because he cannot help but be driven mad by guilt, as if conscience is hardwired into him, as we would say in the 21st century. But by the time Dostoevsky has worked this theme over 15 years and 5 novels, he's in a position to make clear the metaphysical stakes of the question surrounding the proposition, all is permitted. If people began to doubt the immortality of their souls, then love and the desire to continue the life of the world would end. There would be no such thing as immorality, and therefore everything would be permitted. 5 years after Dostoevsky's death, Nietzsche will echo the novelist's understanding of all is permitted in number 253 of The Philosopher's Will to Power. Quote, naivete, as if morality could survive when the God who sanctions it is missing. The beyond absolutely necessary if faith and morality is to be maintained, unquote. But as compelling as Nietzsche is, Dostoevsky had already complicated his insights by novelizing them, that is, by developing the idea of all is permitted through dialogue between and across minds in a process that never definitively concludes. No one wins, no word is the last word. The advantage of this dialogical approach is most clear in the Brothers Karamazov, and while there's no time to go into that now, let me just say that the novel, partly because it is a novel, offers the fullest examination of the continuum of secular and religious conscience, and therefore the modern predicament of conscience that I know. It examines it from the point of view of individual psychology and political activism. It analyzes the potential and actual relationships of conscience to ethics and morality. As many times as I've read Dostoevsky's novels, I feel that my work on his understanding of conscience is just beginning. And so I hope that this conference would be an inspiration in my continuing effort to comprehend Dostoevsky's conscience. So I want to end my introductory remarks by pointing out that conscience, whether religious or secular, has retained through all its historical and conceptual transmutations the two-in-one structure that William Perkins described in 1596. Conscience is our secret sharer, to invoke Conrad, who tells a story about a captain and a castaway in which two know some one secret thing. Two are partners in knowledge of one and the same secret. If, despite these religious, philosophical, and literary representations of the two-in-one structure of conscience, we still experience it in terms of integrity. That integrity is challenged by its realization in a variety of worldly scenarios. One's complex relationships with other people, whether casual or intimate, one's role in an organization, or on a larger scale in a society, one's orientation to politics, one's professional responsibilities. The existential integrity of conscience is fractured in its encounter with the world, from the most humble to the most spectacular, and even on the abstract level of ideas, where we struggle to understand the relation of secular to religious conscience, of conscience to ethics, of conscience to morality. This conference is intended to address as many of these baffling questions as can fit into the next 2 days. So, to quote Maurice Sendak, let the wild rumpus begin. And our first panel, let our first panel begin.
All right, so good morning, everyone, and thank you once again for being here. You're going to get thanked a lot over the next couple of days, probably more than in the entire rest of your lives. Well, I hope not. So I'm just here to introduce our panelists and to thank them so much for being here because, as we've reiterated, many of them have come through flood and fire to do so. So the title of this panel is The Pre-Revolutionary Conscience, From Religious Burden to Natural Right. And our first speaker will be Andrew Murphy, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Walt Whitman Center for the Culture and Politics of Democracy at Rutgers University. His works include Conscience and Community, Revising Toleration and Religious Dissent in Early Modern England and America, and Prodigal Nation, Moral Decline and Divine Punishment from New England to 9/11. And he has also shown that his conscience is highly active and strong by being here, despite many opportunities not to. Professor Mark Valeri will be speaking second. He is E.T. Thompson Professor of Church History at Union Presbyterian Seminary. His most recent work is entitled Heavenly Merchandise, How Religion Shaped Commerce in Puritan America, and he's also among the editors of the multi-volume works of Jonathan Edwards. So after Professor Murphy and Professor Valeri's talks, which will each last about half an hour, our respondent, Caroline Winter, a professor of history and professor by courtesy of classics here at Stanford, will give her remarks, or if she has to leave, someone else will give them for her. And then we'll open up the discussion to general Q&A for the next 45 minutes to an hour. So yeah, thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming our panelists.
Okay, if I put both of them together, maybe that would help. I'm delighted to be here, not least because I have not been to Stanford before, but because, as you've heard, you have power, and you have hot water, and all these things are good. I left a 45-degree house yesterday in New Jersey, and we were on our 10th day without power. But many people have been truly devastated, so we weren't. I've also, I think, never been introduced with the Maurice Sendak quote, which I'm delighted to hear, about the wild rumpus, which I haven't thought of for quite some time. My oldest child is currently on a train to Berkeley doing a do-it-yourself college visit. So if you see me looking at a text message, it's not out of any disrespect. I'm wondering if he got on the right train and where he is. The last I heard from him about a half an hour ago, he said, "Not sure it's the right train, but this is going to be a lot of fun." So all that is just by way of self-explanation. But I am very excited to be here. The invitation was very exciting. The roster is exciting. And all these issues are very much both historical and very timely. So this morning's sessions ask what is conscience and attempt to think about the way that conscience developed in the early American context. I wanted to make some general comments on the notion of conscience as a concept as it emerged in the early modern world, and discuss an important development that took place over the course of the 17th century. Can you hear me? Is this okay? Okay, great. I argued in my book, Conscience and Community. Actually, I was revisiting. I wasn't actually revising toleration, but it's okay. I hope that I revised it a bit too as I revisited it. But I argued in that book that what I called the subjectification of conscience represents one of the most important developments in the early modern history of liberty of conscience. And I've returned to it more recently in work I'm doing currently on William Penn. And so in my time this morning, I want to begin by laying out what I call the orthodox view of conscience, trace this 17th century subjectification and the politics that went along with it, and then close with a few more general words about the transhistorical importance of conscience. And I do have a low-tech handout that might be worth looking at. So first, let me say a few words about conscience in general. As evidenced by this conference and by the broad range of scholarship represented on the roster, conscience remains a central concept in modern religion, modern philosophy, modern politics, modern literature. Early modern campaigns for liberty of conscience were a key element of the political thought of the period and of the emerging liberal democratic tradition more generally. More recently, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, asserts in its very first article that all human beings are, quoting here, endowed with reason and conscience, while Article 18 of the Declaration proclaims the right of all individuals to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And even more recently, scholars like David Richards have drawn analogies between early modern struggles over conscience and movements for racial, gender, and sexual liberation, pressing a concept that was long associated, as we've heard a moment ago, with Christian theology into service far beyond its traditional domain. Given its broad historical reach, from the Church Fathers to contemporary constitutional jurisprudence, conscience can be rather difficult to define precisely. I'll make a pass. Nancy has already made some comments here as well. The term generally refers to a faculty or an act or a capacity, depending on who you're reading, by which individuals assess the moral character of their own actions, either actions they're considering taking or actions they've already taken. Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 2, verse 15, suggests that conscientious behavior is available to all humans, not merely Jews and Christians, based on the notion of some kind of a law written on the human heart. Elaborations of the concept were undertaken by a number of early church fathers, Jerome, Bonaventure, Peter Lombard, Aquinas. The details are well beyond my scope this morning. Suffice it to say that no one uses the term quite the same way. They often use the same words in different ways, and it's all extremely complicated. But let me make a few further general comments to try to set things up a little bit before moving on. Analyses of conscience have traditionally involved two related concepts, synderesis and conscientia, that's on the first sort of bold heading. Synderesis, again, these terms are not used coherently and cohesively by different thinkers. They're often not used consistently by the same thinker over the course of a career, but just sort of we'll go with this as far as it will take us. Synderesis tends to denote the natural knowledge of morality that's available to all humans, while conscience often refers to the application of those general moral principles to specific situations. Aquinas, for example, defined conscience as the application of knowledge to activity, where synderesis gave you the knowledge and conscience was supposed to provide the application to particular circumstances. Most theorists of conscience in the medieval tradition considered synderesis as a kind of natural faculty to be infallible, or at least potentially infallible, but they accepted that conscience could err through the misapplication of general principles to particular situations. Thus, it made sense to speak of erroneous conscience, which is in my title this morning, an individual holding as right an action that was in fact wrong. This might sound odd to modern ears, again, as Nancy was pointing out, since we often equate conscience with individual sincerity or integrity, and the notion of it being wrong may sound odd. So here's the social and the political dilemma. Almost by definition, erroneous conscience is a term that individuals apply to other people. Since if it was erroneous and if you felt your own conscience was erroneous, you would have changed your position. But the question remains, so what should an individual with an erroneous conscience do? Or what am I saying that someone else with an erroneous conscience should do? Should that person follow his or her own conscience regardless, even if it is wrong, on the argument that it's their own and there's a sense of personhood and integrity at stake? Or should they disobey their erroneous conscience since it's telling them to do something wrong? Or again, I'm taking it to be wrong. It's kind of a theological catch-22. An erroneous conscience binds the individual who holds it because it is their conscience, since it represents their moral assessment of their situation. Yet if they follow it, they commit a sin, since they're doing something that's immoral. Now, I'm not going to solve this dilemma. This continues to be a dilemma throughout the period. The agenda of early modern tolerationists, campaigners for liberty of conscience during the 17th century, was not to contest the idea that conscience could be wrong, but rather to seek political protections for individuals holding views considered erroneous by elites and authorities in their community, so long as they comported themselves peacefully with their neighbors. And this agenda involved what I call the subjectification of conscience, which is where I want to turn next. Now, given the religious origins of the notion of conscience, it's not surprising that the early modern campaign for liberty of conscience first took root in the political struggle for religious toleration and the rights of religious dissenters. Early modern tolerationists sought to convince their critics that individuals were the best judges of their own moral and religious responsibilities, and that they could be trusted to make sound choices that balanced respect both for their own consciences and for social order. This is the tension in the title of my first book, Conscience and Community. Locke's letter concerning toleration sought to remove state sanctions and criminal penalties for religious dissenters, and is generally considered a kind of tolerationist urtext. But though Locke is often seen as inaugurating a new way of approaching religion, politics, and society, his view in the letter, I've argued, and others have argued, really breaks no new ground conceptually, but represents a kind of culmination or a digest of more than 100 years of thinking about religion, politics, and society in the English context, written by many people who are no longer household names the way Locke is. Now, well into the 17th century, as I mentioned briefly already, it was considered possible to sin against one's own conscience, to have an erroneous conscience, by misapplying general moral principles to particular situations, and in the process transgressing God's law. In the orthodox formulation, conscience then was inherently objective. carrying a standard of, or external might be another way of putting it, had an external element, carrying a standard of right and wrong that transcended any individual's subjective preferences. A few examples here, and they're on the sheet as well. In 1630, William Ames referred to the adequate rule of conscience as the revealed will of God by which man's duty is prescribed and made known to him. Actually, that one's not on your sheet. Apologies. Again, it's been a long week without power. I hope it's roughly close to what I'm going to be saying. Robert Sanderson in the mid-17th century, and that one I do see on the handout, argued that the immediate norm of conscience is right reason. Conscience is therefore said to be right when it is in accord with right reason, in accord with that law which God, the highest lawgiver, has set over it. For Francis Bugg, writing in 1682, conscience represented an ability in the understanding of man to judge of himself in all he does as to his acceptance or rejection with God. Through the conscience, Bugg wrote, God keeps up his solemn claim of sovereignty over us in our own hearts. And if one's conscience was in error, the reigning understanding of political and religious authority took it for granted that civil governments had the authority and, in fact, the duty to intervene and help individuals set their own consciences right. After all, an erroneous conscience was dangerous, not only to the individual holding it, since they endangered their own immortal salvation, their immortal soul, their eternal salvation, and also, as historical experience showed, to the anti-tolerationists, this is, dangerous to social peace and unity. Samuel Rutherford, writing in the mid-1640s, feared that toleration would bring in not merely liberty of conscience, but, as he put it, liberty of sinning. Now, according to John Cotton, the theological architect of much of New England society, the expulsion of Roger Williams from Massachusetts in the mid-1630s did not constitute an act of persecution. Why? Because here we see the link between erroneous conscience, and persecution. Persecution was, in Cotton's word, the affliction of another for righteousness' sake. So it contained this sort of objective external element. If you were wrong, you might be punished, you might be prosecuted, but by definition, you were not persecuted. If you asserted an erroneous theological position, logically speaking, you could not be persecuted. In fact, in Cotton's view, there was a kind of a germ theory of religious dissent, that there was the danger was not only to the individual, but also, so the metaphors of infection are often used as to the effects of religious dissent on the community more generally. When Cotton referred, now here's the beginning of the kind of transformation that I want to trace this morning. When Cotton referred in a letter to Williams to, quoting here, some point of doctrine which in conscience you believe to be a religious duty, Williams replied that one is persecuted even if one's beliefs are false. So throughout the period, we have a constant reference to questions of whether or not individuals are erroneous in their beliefs as part and parcel of the conversation about whether what's being done to them politically is problematic. The notion of erroneous conscience then gave anti-tolerationists a way to stress fallen human nature and the frequency of individuals to mistake their own moral and religious duties. Now let's look at what changes over the course of the 17th century. As I said, most early modern tolerationists were committed Christians who did not deny the essentially theological nature of the conscience that I've sketched out above. Conscience could err, individuals could be objectively mistaken in their beliefs and practices, but they did, however, stress a subjective element of the faculty of conscience. One based on a number of things. First of all, on an emphasis on Paul's claim in Romans 14 that each person should be convinced in his own mind. Also in a corresponding psychological or epistemological assertion, made again most famous by Locke, but really throughout the literature, that conscience could not be forced, false beliefs could not be coerced away, since conscience resided in our understanding and not in our will. It was not subject to our own decision. William Penn, who I'll talk more about in a few minutes, claimed in 1681 that I do not intend that any person or persons should be in the least harmed for the external exercise of their dissenting consciences in worship to God, though erroneous. So he's admitting that there are people who have objectively mistaken conscientious beliefs, For though their consciences be blind, this one actually somehow ends up, well, it ended up not on the sheet at all. My apologies. For though their consciences be blind, yet they are not to be forced. Such compulsion giveth no sight, neither do corporal punishments produce conviction. So not only were individuals obligated to do God's will, everyone agreed on this. This was a Christian argument largely within the Christian tradition. But the tolerationist position argued that they were obligated to do it voluntarily and without threat of punishment, or else their obedience lacked merit. Although erroneous beliefs should be vigorously contested with argumentation and exhortation, Locke famously wrote that the greatest duty of a Christian is to employ as many exhortations and arguments as possible toward another man's salvation. Coercion in this new emergent view was to be forsworn both as ineffectual and as unchristian. In fact, at the extreme version of this argument would argue, as William Walwyn did in the 1640s, that though the thing may be in itself good, yet if it do not appear to be so to my conscience, the practice thereof in me is sinful. Not only will it not benefit me, but it will be positively harmful to me. So 17th century toleration debates in England and America focused largely on religious dissenters' search for freedom of worship and assembly as the institutional corollaries to a kind of growing respect for free, even if erroneous, conscience. Let me give a couple of specific examples of how this worked itself out. We talk about the Keithian schism in Pennsylvania. Very briefly, a schism erupts within the Pennsylvania Quaker community, driven by a concern about theological laxity. You have separate meetings. These are between 1690 1692. Separate meetings, lots of public disputation between those allied with George Keith, who was a longtime Presbyterian Quaker, or a longtime Scottish Quaker, former Presbyterian, who gains a lot of support outside Philadelphia, and a lot of support from more marginal, less prosperous Quakers, and those sympathetic to the colony's governing elite. The culmination of this is the prosecution of the dissenting leaders in a civil court, and their judges are their fellow Quakers. It's a very complicated, very interesting story. Given the centrality of liberty of conscience both to William Penn and the colony that he founded, it's not surprising to find both sides in this Quaker schism drawing on notions of conscience and justifying their actions. Keith's accuser, Samuel Jennings, defined persecution, and this is on the sheet here, as a suffering inflicted upon the sufferers for the discharge of their duty to God. And this echoes the Orthodox position. You have a Quaker echoing an Orthodox Calvinist position. According to Jennings, the question of whether or not one is persecuted turns on the question of whether or not you are, in fact, discharging your duty to God. If Keith thought he was doing his duty to God in fomenting this religious schism, but he was mistaken, then restraining him is not an infringement on his liberty of conscience, but rather an attempt to get him to listen to his conscience and to reform his misguided behavior. Now, of course, the other side doesn't see it this way, and they take issue with this definition of persecution as describing it as far too narrow, as not including such suffering as is inflicted upon men that may be in error and hold erroneous doctrines and principles. Keith goes on to say that the true definition of persecution is a suffering inflicted upon the sufferers not only for their discharge of their duty to God, but for all that a man thinks to be his duty to God. Thus, we're seeing here a door opening to a broader understanding of conscience's political prerogatives. And as far as the Keithians were concerned, their prosecution was persecution plain and simple, since even if their beliefs were mistaken, they should have had political guarantees to affirm them. Furthermore, and here this gets even more interesting, Keith, who is being prosecuted by the Quaker elite in Pennsylvania, claimed that his position faithfully represented the view of Quakers in the tradition, including Penn and Robert Barclay. And there's something to this argument. Barclay's apology, which is the last one on the front of the sheet here, really one of the touchstone texts of Quaker theology, defined conscience as that persuasion of the mind which arises from the understanding being possessed with the belief of the truth or falsity of anything, which, though it may be false or evil upon the matter, yet if a man should go against his persuasion or conscience, he would commit a sin, because what a man doth contrary to his faith, though his faith be wrong, is no ways acceptable to God. As we heard a few minutes ago, I mentioned Penn also said that though your conscience may be erroneous, there's an argument for its political protection. Now, this was, of course, not convincing to those who were in the running the legal system in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania Quakers dismissed his claims. They convicted him, though it's not clear he ever served any jail time or paid his fine. And in their response, they stressed not theological issues, but social and political ones. This is the top passage on the second side of the handout. In the infancy of the settlement of Pennsylvania, the legislators saw cause to make provision by a law to secure the reputation of the magistrates from the contempt of others. They charged here that the dissenters had slandered civil magistrates, quote, pretending it was for matters purely religious, and had endeavored to raise sedition and subvert the government, and for that cause only, and not upon any religious account were they prosecuted. So on this response, no claim of conscience could justify the sort of divisive behavior that the dissenters had engaged in, which was a gross violation of Christian liberty. I commend this small, very little-known Quaker schism to all of your attention. It's quite remarkable and is very rarely commented on. Let me say a few things about Penn, since the long shadow of Penn and his storied career as a proponent of toleration lay behind a lot of these disputes, and the legacy of Penn himself cast a long shadow. I'm wrapping up a book on Penn's political thought, but I want to focus in just on one piece by Penn this morning, his 1685 Persuasive to Moderation, which defines conscience as the apprehension and persuasion a man has of his duty to God. Thus, liberty of conscience, which is the salient political question of the day, is a free and open profession and exercise of that duty. Now, Penn's responding in this work to a critic who had said, in something that sounds familiar to the Orthodox view, punishing the professors and practicers of a true religion purely for that religion, whilst they continue living innocently and inoffensively in all things to the civil government, is real persecution and truly anti-Christian. Thus, the heathen emperors of Rome and their subordinate officers were truly persecutors, and the primitive Christians truly persecuted. On the other hand, the punishing of offenders whose religion is false or feigned, and who only make a color or a show of it to carry on other designs, is not only lawful, but just and necessary. In other words, there are two kinds of people, or two kinds of conscience claims, which deserve no protection from legal penalties. First, those with an erroneous conscience, those who profess a false religion, the first here. Secondly, those whose religion is feigned, who make a show of religion to disguise self-interested or seditious motives. Now, by contrast, of course, Penn is defining liberty of conscience not as based on an objectively correct set of beliefs, but on an individual's own sense of his or her own duty to God. True religion, Penn points out, is an intensely contested question. He says unity in these matters is out of our power, and harmony is a thing to be wished for rather than expected. And since Protestants had forsworn Catholic arguments from infallibility, and since Protestants have historically refused to suspend the right of individual judgment in matters of faith, the question of whether or not one's religious beliefs were true, in Penn's argument, is politically irrelevant. What matters is peaceful comportment with one's neighbors. Now, his insistence on removing true religion from the definition of persecution, and this emphasis on inner conviction at the heart of religion, is nothing new either to Penn or to the tradition more generally. His very first work on toleration from 1668, also on the back of the sheet, defined liberty of conscience as the free and uninterrupted exercise of our consciences. In that way of worship, we are most clearly persuaded God requires us to serve him in, which, being a matter of faith, we sin if we omit. Now, there's an internal locus of responsibility here, removes the orthodox element of true religion, and to the critics of this view, open up the potential for dissenters to claim conscience for all sorts of anarchic, licentious, and hedonistic actions. But there are always limits to Penn's view of conscience. To return back to the 1685 persuasive to moderation, he hedges in this conscience that he's just liberated, in a sense, by reiterating fairly conventional parameters of moral conduct and good citizenship. I always premise this conscience to keep within the bounds of morality, that it be neither frantic nor mischievous, but a good subject, a good child, a good servant, as exact to yield to Caesar the things that are Caesar's, as jealous of withholding from God the things that are God. Now, what determined whether or not individuals deserved protection to pursue their religious understandings, even if they were mistaken in Penn's view, was the degree to which they comported themselves peacefully within their families and neighborhoods. Now, the bulk of this work, which I won't go into a whole lot more this morning, is devoted to taking on these two historical primary objections to granting liberty of conscience. First of all, the political argument that it endangers the state, and second, the religious argument that it abandons erroneous individuals to their errors, imperils their own salvation, and undermines true religion. In seeking to make toleration both politically and religiously palatable, Penn illustrates the twofold nature of argument for toleration. First, that peaceful, politically loyal conscience should be granted liberty and protection. And secondly, that claims about religious error and erroneous conscience should be considered politically irrelevant. Penn's political arguments represent his attempt to answer critics who had long linked religious dissent and political rebellion and disloyalty, going back to the English Civil War. He points to historical evidence that religious divisions have often coexisted with political stability, both in England and in Europe, ranges far and wide through history in a kind of Penn is not a disciplined thinker. He's an interesting thinker, but not a disciplined one, ranging across history, offering examples of places from ancient Israel to the Roman Empire, to Poland, to Denmark, in which religious diversity and social peace have coexisted. Now, at the heart of Penn's political argument in this piece, and really in his political thinking more generally, is a vision of moderate, prudential government driven by a search for policies that are in the interest of both governors and governed. He sought to convince his readers that toleration was in the interest both of magistrates and the people. Repealing penal laws would remove the chief complaints of dissenters against the government, denial of trial by jury, imprisonment, seizure of goods without due process, and so on, and a host of petty harassments of everyday life. But rulers, he argued, would benefit from this policy, as well as the people's affections and interests would be aligned with the king, who would no longer be picking and choosing between useful citizens based on their religious views. We also get, of course, in Penn's view, standard arguments about trade and prosperity being advanced by toleration. He took great pleasure in pointing out the links between the commercial dynamism of the Netherlands and its policy of religious toleration. Now, with regard to the particularly religious arguments that toleration allows for the persistence of error and undermines the church, he offers a number of familiar responses, familiar to anyone who's familiar with Locke's letter on toleration. Belief is part of the understanding and not the will, thus it can't be forced. Christ himself, the biblical references, forbade fire from heaven, taught forbearance. You often get the parable of the wheat and the tares. The early church refused to persecute dissenters. Protestants eschew arguments from infallibility, and so on and so forth. All in all, then, what we've got in Penn's work is indicative of a larger move that I'm talking about, which I hope to shed some light here in the last few minutes. It's a view as firmly grounded in the Christian tradition as the one that it sought to supplant, as ready to believe that individuals could misperceive what God required of them in any given situation, but firm in its insistence that erroneous conscience, mistaken beliefs, conducted with a degree of discretion and goodwill towards one's neighbors and not used as a cover for seditious behavior, merited political protection. Let me end with a few more general remarks. Of course, the story does not end with Penn, otherwise the conference would be over by lunchtime. Later thinkers tended to place more emphasis on individuals' internal deliberations and less on the theological backdrop, which was so central to the 17th century view. Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiment, 1759, Smith analogized the process of assessing our own actions to imagining how an impartial spectator would judge us. Immanuel Kant advanced the notion of conscience as akin to an internal court or internal judge. And John Stuart Mill, in On Liberty, set out to defend what he called the appropriate region of human liberty, which he described as requiring liberty of conscience in the most comprehensive sense, which turns out to involve liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative, scientific, moral, or theological. It's a fairly capacious definition. But it's also true that some thinkers have taken issue with the heavily theological and philosophical inflection of these views. Far from a faculty for ascertaining the will of God or a moral sense with its own moral foundations, Charles Darwin suggested, quoting here, that any animal endowed with well-marked social instincts would inevitably acquire a sense of moral sense or conscience as soon as its intellectual powers had become as well developed or nearly well developed as in man. In Darwin's account, the conscience was grounded in the social instincts, including sympathy. And these instincts, no doubt, were primarily gained through natural selection. We've heard about Nietzsche already once this morning. The second essay of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals, 1887, presents conscience as resulting from the internalization of aggressive instincts, with the bad conscience, as he calls it, representing a declaration of war against the old instincts. Freud, of course, subsumed conscience within the superego, a psychological projection of parental authority that functioned largely to punish and shame. We're a long way here, of course, from the traditional view of individuals discerning God's laws in the midst of moral complexities. Of course, the building blocks of conscience in Freudian accounts lay largely in some combination of childhood experiences and instinctual drives. All of these critics, Darwin, Nietzsche, and Freud, offer naturalistic, not theological or philosophical explanations of conscience. But we're still getting at some fairly broad and parallel questions. What is that faculty by which individuals come to grips with the propriety of their own actions and those of their neighbors? Is a commitment to liberty of conscience, as it developed over the course of the 17th century, the core of a respect for human rights, or the death of any notion, a meaningful notion of community? Early modern tolerationists certainly thought it was the former. Their anti-tolerationist opponents thought it was the latter. In the contemporary United States, for example, conscience is implicated in any number of divisive social issues. For example, in the healthcare field, do pharmacists have a right to refuse to dispense medications of which they disapprove on conscientious grounds? Should pro-life doctors or nurses or hospitals run by the Catholic Church be able to opt out of participation in certain procedures related to reproductive health? I'm sure we'll hear more about this today or tomorrow. Our contemporary arguments about religious liberty, gay rights, and racial equality, are they late modern realizations of the promise implicit in early modern arguments, or do they promise something more sinister? In his opinion, in the 1990 Smith case, which many of you may be familiar with, Justice Scalia envisioned a scenario in which conscience-based exemptions to generally applicable laws would lead to an anarchic situation in which, quoting him here, each conscience is a law to itself, unquote. Clearly, early modern struggles over conscience and toleration continue to provoke spirited political debates centuries after thinkers like Locke and Penn have passed from the scene. Thank you.
Hearing Nancy's comments in Andrew's paper, I realized how much overlap there is. So maybe that's a good thing. It shows that we're coming to some common convictions about this very large topic. I'm going to switch the focus a little bit away from freedom of conscience or freedom of religious conscience to how religion shaped moral conscience, which is to say convictions about proper social behavior. And I'm going to do so in a very particular context, which is to say Anglo-American culture, writings coming out of England and its American colonies from 1630 to 1750. It's going to be somewhat more philosophical than I think most of us would want to tolerate for an extended length, but I think the peculiar arguments help frame a larger conversation if we get these things nailed down. I'll try to lighten it up with a little bit of a talk about social behavior in the meantime, but stick to some very kind of tightly discussed turns in the philosophy of conscience. The thesis is this: long-standing assumptions that the religious community gave rules by which individuals were to judge their behaviors yielded between 1630 and 1750 to a widespread conviction that conscience was a self-reflexive act, a perception of one's own mental unease at certain actions and pleasure at others. Language about conscience came to focus on internal mental operations rather than a straightforward comparison of one's deeds with a tradition's rules. So in order to make quick work of this very long subject, I'm going to pin my comments to simply three moral texts, one appearing in 1639, one in 1691, and one in 1725. So the first text, which represents the older traditional pre-modern notion of moral conscience, is William Ames's Conscience with the Power and Cases Thereof, which was published in 1639. Now, educated at Cambridge, a consultant to several international religious synods, a leading Puritan light, and a chaplain to Dutch and English merchants in the Netherlands, Dr. Ames, as he was called, had achieved notoriety by the time his treatise appeared. Often reprinted and included in the course of study at the fledgling Harvard College in Massachusetts Bay, Ames's Cases of Conscience influenced a wide range of readers in England and Puritan New England. He was also read by Church of England clergy. They looked to Ames to provide practical teaching on a range of moral matters such as dueling and divorce, almsgiving, just war, obligations between masters and servants, and usury. Ames's work was no sectarian treatise. He followed standard Roman Catholic teaching and admitted as much, that described the conscience as a faculty of reason by which people could judge the right or wrong of their past moral deeds or actions that they contemplated. Conscience was a rational application of God-given rules to an individual's actions. It, as Ames said, belongs to the understanding. It is a practical judgment by which that which a man knoweth is particularly applied to that which is either good or evil. Ames even described conscience as the final conclusion to a logical syllogism. The first premise of the syllogism, think Philosophy 101, was the revealed law of God, the Bible in his case. The second premise was the fact of the moral deed under question, who did what. Conscience was simply the conclusion, the badness or goodness of the deed and actor. So, to take one example, Ames argued that the Bible condemned usury, that merchants who made loan contracts for a profit committed usury, and that, the conclusion, the conscience, such merchants violated God's law. Ames and other moralists, Protestant and Catholic, used the cases of conscience method to solve moral dilemmas with the assumption that such solutions functioned as a communal standard or rule. Once the community understood through rational analysis whether usury or oath-taking or fealty to the monarch, contemporary questions, accorded with the Word of God, then it could command its members to submit to such rules on these matters. In this sense, the act of conscience was the individual's application of communally sanctioned rules to their personal actions. Conscience served as judge rather than legislator. Ames admitted, of course, that people often came to defective moral judgments or exercised, Andrew's paper comes to mind, what we might call today bad conscience. In some cases, people misunderstood the major premise, the very meaning of the law. In other cases, people misconstrued the minor premise. They attempted to obscure the facts of the case by claiming that their actions were not covered by the law. So, to stick to the example of usury, Ames's Dutch merchants might falsely assert that making loan contracts that guaranteed them a profit had nothing to do with the usury condemned in the Bible. In the worst cases, people attempted to escape the logic of the syllogism. They might excuse themselves by arguing that they never intended to commit usury or that their business would fail if they followed the moral law. Such excuses, Ames maintained, amounted to an irrational denial of the logic and made them all the more guilty no matter how they felt about the issue. The cases of conscience method flourished during the second half of the 17th century as Protestant divines deployed it to address an increasing array of moral dilemmas. In economic matters, the vexing issue of the day concerned emergent commercial practices such as usury and market pricing. A particularly telling case in point concerned a middling merchant named Robert Kane, who had immigrated from London to Boston in 1735. In 1639, did I say 1735? In 1635. In 1639, the very year that Ames's book was published, fellow merchants accused Kane of selling nails at high profit margins. The civil court in Massachusetts found Kane guilty of what they called oppression, or undue price inflation, and the First Church of Boston, a Puritan congregation to which Kane belonged, hauled the merchant before a disciplinary trial and threatened him with excommunication. Throughout these trials, a cause célèbre in the small, tight-knit fledgling town of Boston, Kane protested his innocence. He explained that it was common for English merchants to raise the price of one set of commodities beyond their going rate in order to recoup losses from disasters at sea or bad deals. The pastor of the church, John Cotton, responded. He blasted Kane in a sermon that was in effect a study in the cases of conscience method. Cotton explained that the Bible condemned the false principles that allowed a merchant, quote, to sell as dear as he can and buy as cheap as he can. Puritan preachers in England had condemned such market-driven tactics for years. In Ames's terms, Kane had misconstrued the minor premise of the case. The Bible, in fact, prohibited the very practices that made profits for Kane, and therefore he had wrongly excused himself. Acting to rectify his conscience, the church censured him. Dozens of wayward merchants were thereafter brought up on similar charges throughout the 1650s in Massachusetts Bay. And Kane, as it turned out, submitted to the community. He corrected his conscience, repented, was received back into the church, and donated a third of his estate for public building projects and benevolences in Boston. Ames's cases of conscience and the story of Kane represent an early modern understanding of moral judgment. Conscience amounted to the final stage in a process of moral reasoning that began with the religious text, the Bible, moved through the community's interpretation of the text, and ended with an authoritative conclusion for the individual who was bound to apply that conclusion to his or her own circumstances and actions. 52 years after Ames's cases of conscience, in February 1691, John Tillotson, the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral in London, preached a sermon at England's Royal Chapel that demonstrated the beginning of a transition in the meaning of moral conscience for Anglo-American Protestants. The sermon was titled, "A Conscience Void of Offense." Among Tillotson's audience was Princess Anne, the daughter of the recently deposed James II and the future Queen of England. Raised in a dissenting family, Tillotson himself was destined for promotion. 2 months after his sermon, he became the Archbishop of Canterbury. Tillotson preached with less tightly reasoned certainty than did a previous generation of Protestant moralists. In between Ames's cases and Tillotson's sermon, English Protestants had endured a civil war, observed the wars of religion on the European continent, witnessed the confusion of diplomatic alliances among Protestant and Catholic states, and encountered the consequent rise of philosophical skepticism about religious truth claims. Such crises had unsettled assumptions that there was a unified religious community that could, in effect, deduce, that verb is very important, moral rules from the Bible in a definitive manner for all of society. Tillotson had, in fact, experienced his own moral confusion during the previous 3 years. He supported the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which resulted in the deposition of James II and accession of William of Orange to the throne, in violation of his previous oath of loyalty to James. Given as it was during a time of intellectual and political transition, Tillotson's sermon understandably reflected a mixture of ideas about conscience. Taking a customary definition, the future archbishop began by claiming that conscience was chiefly a judge, a kind of court or tribunal in a person's breast where he tries himself according to the commands of God. Quote, "We should reverence our consciences and stand in awe of them and have a great regard to their testimony and verdict." He wrote as though conscience was a personality apart from our inner selves. When instructed by divine revelation, quote, "Conscience is a domestic judge and a kind of familiar God." Affirming Christian teaching throughout his sermon, then, Tillotson argued that the most persuasive motive to obey conscience rested on the prospect of future reward and punishment. And it strikes me, just ad hoc, that the appeal to heavenly reward or punishment emerges more strongly in this period the less that the moral rules and the community's sanction come into play. That is, if you decrease kind of the notion that there's this objective standard that the community enforces, and therefore the motive to obey is a fear of being shunned by the community. Once that is done, then I think the language of heaven and hell, salvation enters in actually more forcefully in this period. It's something striking that the latitudinarians, deists, and then 18th century evangelicals, really big on this afterlife stuff and future reward and punishment. So that's the traditional part of Tillotson. Yet Tillotson quickly hedged his readings with warnings that, to quote him, "ignorance, unreasonable and obstinate prejudices, bias of self-interest, and passion and zeal frequently muddled the ways in which people read the dictates of conscience, clearly disturbed by the prospect of religious strife, coded in words such as zeal and prejudice." Tillotson did not rely on an explication of texts, which were subject to partisan readings. He turned instead to people's inner dispositions. If one was calm, peaceful, and sincere, then one could be confident that their consciences were settled, as he wrote, upon clear reason rather than upon rage, dogmatism, and irrational zeal. Moral self-judgment was reliable if it operated with modesty and humility and a teachable temper. We should therefore, quote, "be conscious to ourselves of our own sincerity, free from external compulsion, free from violent passions and violent powers." Tillotson's sermon marked an intellectual transformation. In an attempt to describe moral conscience apart from sectarian doctrine, he searched for moral categories that crossed boundaries between traditional Anglicanism, Reformed dissent, and latitudinarian reason. In doing this, Tillotson drew in part from the philosophy of John Locke, a friend and political ally. Published 2 years before Tillotson's sermon, Locke's famous essay concerning human understanding argued that human minds could perceive not only external objects, but also their own operations. We could detect how the mind gathered impressions into complex ideas or ideas of reflection, including moral qualities. All reasonable people, Locke contended, did this in a similar manner, making such observations of the mind the basis for society-wide judgments about moral issues. Locke argued that moral reflection could be called truly rational when it followed universal philosophical precepts induced, there's the different verb, from the mind's operations rather than from texts such as the Bible, about which people argued violently. Locke's influence can be seen especially in the most striking phrase from Tillotson's sermon, "Be conscious to ourselves." Tillotson inserted into the conversation the prospect that knowledge of one's self, of one's own internal or mental condition, could affect moral discernment. He redirected the standard of judgment away from rules to an awareness of internal dispositions, such as one's dispassion, sincerity. In so doing, he reframed the identity of the moral community that informed judgment from a particular church to a nation of Protestants held together by common notions of reason and sincerity. Tillotson was immensely popular on both sides of the Atlantic. New England ministers through the 1720s cited him as an authority despite his Anglicanism and their Puritanism. His attempt to navigate between Christian rules and a broad-based Lockean morality influenced Boston preachers such as Cotton Mather and Ebenezer Pemberton, who urged their parishioners to measure, amongst other things, their business practices less by specific rules than by virtuous dispositions. As the economy in Massachusetts was maturing into a genuinely transatlantic system with regular trade through the Caribbean to England, up and down the Atlantic seaboard, and dependable market networks from Boston into interior towns, the leaders of Boston's churches deconstructed the old pattern of religious discipline that coerced conformity to traditional precepts. Rather than arraign people before church trials for commercial misdeeds, they urged the inculcation of inner virtues such as honesty, patriotism, and charity to ennoble business. They began to shift the power of conscience from a judgment on specific behaviors to a reflection on moral character. Changes in teaching about usury reflected this shift. Led by Mather, Cotton Mather, the Boston pastor, a synod of Massachusetts pastors decreed in 1699 that usury no longer be viewed necessarily as a sin. They did not embrace secular reason. I don't think this whole story is captured by secularization, at least not yet. But they did dismiss traditional readings of the Bible that prohibited usury and replaced them with universal moral obligations. They urged merchants to attend to the end of trade, which was, as they put it, humane society, and the principle that ought to guide social exchange, which was, quote, the law of equity and the law of charity. Notice those are very different conceptions of laws, the law of equity and the law of charity, rather than the law of Deuteronomy 5:20 or whatever. The new it is an eternal and glorious rule of charity, the pastors decreed, that in dealing with a neighbor, a man must propose his neighbor's advantages as well as his own, and he should not propose to make his own advantage by adding to his neighbor's misery. The new attitude toward conscience is captured by the phrases, a man must propose to help his neighbor and should not propose to injure his neighbor. Motive, intention, and inner attitude toward neighbor provided the material on which conscience worked. As one of Mather's colleagues put it, merchants ought to follow their, quote, scruples and use discretion and piety rather than customary rules to inform such matters as loan rates, prices, and profit margins. Faithful church-going merchants from this period in Boston took such teaching on conscience seriously. Traders such as Thomas Fitch prided themselves on their devotion to God and the empire. As long as they kept their accounts honestly and avoided fraud, refrained from avarice, loved God more than their wealth, devoted themselves to the cause of English Protestantism, gave money for the church, and kept their souls free from worldly anxiety, They could, without guilt, deploy business tactics that a previous generation of moralists had decreed to be violations of God's law, making loan contracts that guaranteed a profit, pursuing lawsuits over debt in civil courts, pricing their goods according to market dynamics, and speculating in currency, mortgages, and other credit instruments. Influenced by Tillotson, the New England slave trader Hugh Hall consoled his conscience with the thoughts that he was polite, diligent, and charitable, even as he trafficked in human cargo. This is not to suggest that the idea of conscience represented by Tillotson left such merchants to follow their own devices. Religious mandates for personal virtue, patriotism, altruism, spiritual devotion, honesty, and sincerity informed conscience in ways that overruled completely self-interested passions. The third text I want us to consider appeared 34 years after Tillotson's Sermon on Conscience. In 1725, Francis Hutcheson offered his An Inquiry into the Original of Our Ideas of Beauty and Virtue. Born into a family of Scottish Presbyterians who had immigrated to Ulster, Hutcheson studied at Glasgow before organizing and leading a dissenting academy in Dublin. There he encountered the ideas of the third Earl of Shaftesbury. Tutored by Locke himself, Shaftesbury had suggested in a 1711 treatise that Locke and Tillotson had not adequately explained the origin of those moral sentiments that conscience worked upon. True enough, Shaftesbury argued, the mind observed itself as it negotiated between virtues, such as compassion and particular social behaviors, but whence those virtues? Left unexplained, they seemed to derive from an overly complex series of rational deliberations that had little to do with the ways in which ordinary people made moral choices. Shaftesbury argued that they were inherent in the mind itself. One did not need philosophical training to sense pleasure as one did the good, and shame as one did evil. Moral sensibilities operated naturally as an inseparable component of self-awareness. Conscience did more than judge the self. It provided the very criteria by which the self was to be judged, its own sense of the rightness of sociability and the wrongness of viciousness. Shaftesbury's ideas appeared to many moralists to have reduced conscience to base instinct, a pleasure principle, or sheer self-interest. Hutcheson, then, getting to our text, determined to defend Shaftesbury by showing how people's innate moral sensibilities led them not to vicious self-interest, but to social affections such as benevolence. In the inquiry, he argued from common experience, we sense within ourselves approbation when we see others behave charitably, or read a play whose hero sacrifices self for others, or recognize our own decision to speak honestly. Conversely, we sense disapproval when we observe other people behave in a mean manner, read of treachery, or realize that we have just placed our own interests above the needs of others. As Hutcheson put it, we have, quote, an instinct antecedent to all reason from interest, which influences us to the love of others, even as the moral sense determines us to approve the actions which flow from this love in ourselves or others. In the most striking section of his treatise, Hutcheson attempted to align social virtues with instincts to self-love. He contended that the feeling that attended moral approval was mental pleasure. It was satisfying, even conducive to happiness, to observe virtue. Benevolence produced the highest degree and most enduring sense of pleasure. Acts of narrow self-interest to the harm of others gave mental pain. In the long run, then, acting sociably or having love to other people were quite remarkably completely congruent with happiness and therefore self-interest. This, Hutcheson argued, protected conscience from vicious self-love and at the same time reflected the beauty of the moral cosmos, a system designed by God to coordinate individual self-interest, love for others, and reverence for the Creator. In cases where vicious self-interest overwhelmed benevolence, Hutcheson mentioned cannibalism, unjust war, and the slave trade as examples, the job of the moralist or fellow citizen was to urge more moral reflection, more attention to sensation. Such deeds thereby would discover themselves as sources of self-degradation and unhappiness. Conscience did not need traditional rules or the mandates of national interest to direct individuals to right choices. One only had to pursue one's own interests if they were understood properly to reside in a regard for humanity. Hutcheson well knew that there were political implications to this line of thought. As a Scottish dissenter in Ireland, he had little regard for the English Parliament and Crown. He intended to show that conscience operated reliably, sociably, benevolently, responsibly among all people, regardless of political status and learning. He derived a theory of universal human rights from his moral treatises and became a favorite of Whiggish agitators against English power. Hutcheson and his followers perceived a moral framework, the community to which conscience bound the actor, to be not the church or even the English nation, but the law of nature. So when we think of the term law of nature, I think sometimes we imagine this kind of hyper-rationalistic deduction from things out there, what rules of right and wrong are, whereas I'm saying the law of nature, as reading this period, is the law that our consciences perceive, pleasure at benevolence and pain at viciousness. Hutcheson's inquiry gave rise to the so-called moral sense school of ethics, which dominated moral thought in Britain and America through the 1770s. It claimed among its students the Anglican divine Joseph Butler, the philosopher David Hume, and the economist Adam Smith. The development of the English novel in this period also reflected the influence of the moral sense school, as writers such as Samuel Richardson authored fictional narratives intended to elicit compassion or disgust from readers as forms of moral judgment. Hutcheson was a liberal religious thinker of deist bent, but the transformation of conscience represented by his inquiry did not indicate individualism, subjectivity, or secularism. It meant social sensibility. Indeed, one of Hutcheson's influential adherents was New England's most famous divine from the 18th century, the Calvinist evangelical Jonathan Edwards. In his 1753 treatise, The Nature of True Virtue, Edwards followed Hutcheson's moral sense in setting the definition of conscience. It was, quote, a disposition in man to be uneasy in a consciousness of being inconsistent with himself. That is, if the self truly sought happiness, that it became uneasy when it acted in a way that brought unhappiness by incurring guilt or shame. And it was, quote, a natural principle that does, listen, this is this evangelical Calvinist writing this, that does habitually, spontaneously, instantaneously, and as it were insensibly, which means without conscious self-effort, arise in the mind that benevolence or love to others brought the approval of self, others, and God. For, Edwards wrote, as all virtue or moral good may be resolved into love to others, either God or creatures, so men easily see the uniformity and natural agreement there is between loving others and being accepted and favored by others. Conscience, that is, was a mental operation in which the mind inherently felt unease or pain at the perception of inhumanity and felt the ease at benevolence. Edwards, unlike Hutcheson, proceeded to argue that only love for God could fully satisfy the conscience, but Edwards depended on Hutcheson's terms to explain how conscience worked. It was the mind's reflection on itself, the interior senses of pain and pleasure, rather than a rational or objective adjudication between received rules and social behavior. I'm going to skip, in order to make sure Carolyn gets her say, I'm going to skip a section that says this, you can see it being worked out in mid-18th century New England merchants who do all kinds of modern proto-capitalistic behaviors attuned to their inner sense that they're sincere, that they're benevolent in what they do, with very little attention to traditional rules. The transition from Ames's Cases of Conscience to Tillotson's Conscience Void of Offense and then Hutchinson's Inquiry suggests that the retreat from traditional rules, such as the Bible, to the operations of the mind, as the material that informed conscience, did not in themselves represent individualism or moral autonomy. To be sure, the story turns inward. Conscience is people's reflections on their interior states. Yet the moralists discussed here framed their understanding of conscience in religious and communal terms. Tillotson and his followers were motivated by a religious agenda that legitimated a broad consensus of English Protestants who looked within their minds rather than dogmatic tradition to find common ground. Hutchison sought to plumb a natural law of innate affections that bound all people to revere the creator of a moral system in which happiness and benevolence cohered. These writers exhibited astonishing optimism. It was no small feat to dislodge conscience from received texts and lodge it in self-perception, a breathtaking confidence that God had, in fact, given every human mind the internal faculties to sense immediately the distinctions between virtue and vice. That allowed all people to claim moral competence. It legitimated the notion of individual rights to moral self-determination. Yet it also offered a singular vision of natural law and the harmonies of creation. Moralists that I've discussed above constructed versions of sociability, humaneness, and benevolence within their own cultural milieu. They did not lapse into subjectivism, rather they offered a universal authority of moral reason in an 18th century Protestant and English context, and they called it divine creation. We might question whether such optimism was justified. What if in their wake subsequent moral thinkers severed self-reflection from any notion of divine order? What if people of different religious traditions questioned the theological premises of their ideas that God had imbued the mind with moral dispositions? If that were to happen, then the turn inward without recourse to religious rules would belie the notion that they had secured conscience by locating it in human nature itself.
Can you hear me? Yes, excellent. What was conscience? The American context is the title of this session. And as the first session of the conference, it seems appropriate to take the opportunity to try to ask the broadest questions possible about the task we're embarking on today and tomorrow. I regret that I was not able to respond as fully to Professor Murphy's paper as I might have liked, through no fault of his own, but I think that some of the issues I raise here apply to it as well. Let me begin with some questions about the panel as a whole. The questions are three about place, time, and terminology. First, what is the appropriate spatial framing context for an exploration of early views of conscience? This panel has focused mostly on Anglo-America, including Scotland and Ireland. But we might ask if there is also a broader Atlantic conversation, porous and shifting. Professor Murphy's paper opens with the global resonance of conscience ideas in the modern world, as enunciated, for example, in the UN Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And this panel moves us into a much earlier world that may, in fact, have been geographically broad in reach, though not yet global, of course. Mark Valeri's paper is a good example. He deftly moves us from England to Scotland to Ireland to America. But his paper also shows that there is an ongoing process of continual interchange beyond these points. I had the advantage of reading the full paper, so he does do this in his paper. The English Puritan divine William Ames forged his reputation in Holland in his battle against the Arminians, while John Tillotson, soon to be Archbishop of Canterbury, was influenced by the continental philosophical skepticism embodied in Pierre Bayle. So the Anglo-American idea of conscience was being worked out in an international political and religious context that no doubt continued into the 19th and 20th centuries. The takeaway is that the American context of conscience has always been, in fact, an international context. The second panel question is this: what is the appropriate chronological framing of early ideas about conscience? This panel has identified some discourses as pre-revolutionary, which implicitly sets up the American Revolution as the end point, or at the very least a turning point, for certain discourses about conscience. This framing implies a movement from a world in which invocations of conscience were primarily religious to their increasing politicization during the revolutionary period, though as both papers, especially Professor Murphy's, show, religion and politics were always thoroughly intertwined in the 17th century. But in what ways was the American Revolutionary era, which includes the Constitution-making period, a turning point or end point for conscience discourses? And why? Which conscience discourses continued unchanged through the political upheaval, and which were transformed? Third, this panel invites us to probe how we handle terminology. When is conscience called conscience, and when is it called something else? How important is the term conscience, and to what degree have other words rushed into the breach to take over and even imperialize new territory that was once occupied by conscience? I couldn't resist running a keyword search for the word conscience in Google's Ngram. Plugged into British American publications from 1500 to 2000, the career of the word conscience was surprising, I might even say shocking. The greatest usage by far was in the 17th century, but it went up and down dramatically, marked by huge peaks and valleys, as though conscience went in and out of popularity overnight, like the pet rock. Usage of the word conscience dropped to nearly zero around 1700. I was thinking of poor John Locke here. Nothing special, it should be noted, happened to the word conscience during the American Revolutionary era. It was pretty much a flat line, hovering at a lukewarm mid-range of popularity. Compare this, though, to the usage of the word conscience in French texts from 1500 to 2000. While there is not 100% overlap between the French and English usages of the term, there is enough that this seemed like an instructive comparison. The French term for conscientious objector, for example, is objecteur de conscience, so we might expect this kind of keyword search to pick up relevant material. It turns out that the term was not just popular in 17th century French texts, but has been rising steadily since 1815 to reach an all-time high today, up from Waterloo. The moral of the story is twofold, it seems to me, beyond the fact that the French may be more conscientious than we are. First, we need to track the ways in which the word conscience no longer actually describes the ever-broadening field of inquiry we are hoping to capture. And if we're not just looking for the word conscience, what are we looking for? Second, we need to keep looking beyond the Anglo-American lexical field and worry about how evolving ideas of conscience are rising and falling in other places. Now for some questions about Professor Valeri's paper specifically. Valeri's remarkably lucid essay traces the transformation of conscience over the 17th and 18th centuries. He shows an important series of transformations, from conscience as an objective truth claim lodged in the Bible, to conscience as a quasi-organ in the minds and brains of individual people inhabiting a social order rooted in nature. He shows the movement from 17th century theological authority to 18th century social philosophy, from conscience as a judgment of specific behaviors to conscience as a reflection on moral character, from conscience as a glimpse of the divine to conscience as a quality not just unmoored from the deity, but in fact the very measure of humanity's independent moral self-competence. By the 18th century, humanity had claimed much moral authority from God. Such a transformation, Valeri shows, was both soothing and alarming to an 18th century world increasingly enmeshed in international networks of economic exchange. The new idea of conscience was soothing because it suggested that acting with conscience was not just good for society, but good for the self, part of the pursuit and even achievement of happiness. But the new idea of conscience was also alarming because it threatened to drain any larger cosmic significance from acting conscientiously. The highest arbiter of conscience was now society rather than God. The stakes of conscience seemed somehow to have gotten both bigger and smaller simultaneously. This shift to the idea of conscience as something radically internal, that is implicitly beyond the reach of church, state, and society, was a profound revolution. There was now a place in every human mind or brain in which a silent Supreme Court of one handed down decisions. When this silent judge aligned with the expectations of something now deemed outside the self, that is society, then all went smoothly. But now when the conscientious internal self and society were at odds, it was difficult to know how to adjudicate the conflict. Who should prevail in such conflicts, the self or society? No longer could the idea of a divinely inspired Bible serve as the final authority in the matter. The dilemma remains with us today. The loss of the idea of the Bible as the divine final judge of conscience was both liberating and profoundly unsettling. It liberated humans to explore new areas of conscience while also increasing the number of ways in which the idea of conscience could now conflict with evolving modern social mores. So here are my questions for Professor Valeri. Question 1. Is this shift away from the Bible necessarily a move toward secularism, or is it simply an expansion of the genres in which conscience operates? Perhaps the use of conscience was simply growing and imperializing over the course of the 18th century, remaining sturdy as ever in religious discourse, but now colonizing other genres too, such as law and psychology. Perhaps this trend, in other words, should be read as an expansion of religion rather than a retreat of religion. I noticed that this was also one of Nancy Ruttenberg's questions for the conference as a whole. Is the enduring vitality of conscience a sign that the process of secularization remains incomplete, even in secular rationalists? And it appears as well in Andrew Murphy's paper, in which he argues that the transition he is tracing was as firmly grounded in the Christian tradition as the one that it sought to supplant. So this is the perfect panel to begin addressing the question of what we mean by the secularization of conscience. Question 2, what is the causal mechanism for change? Professor Valeri's sample is ministers in Anglo-America and merchants in Boston who formed an important constituency pressing on older biblically based ideas about the functioning of markets in society. This is a logical and fruitful sample to choose. But it got me wondering, were there also other forces propelling the shift of conscience from theological authority to social philosophy? For example, the market also brought with it the expansion of slavery, a practice legitimized in the Bible, depending on where you look, but one that increasingly became one of the matters that press most insistently on the conscience conversation. And what about discourses that ran parallel to the boisterous 17th century political world in which the conscience conversation was first fully articulated, but that nonetheless had a huge effect on it? What, for example, was the influence of biblical criticism? The idea from the 17th century forward that the Bible is not an objective Xerox machine-like replica of God's revealed law, but rather a historically created human production that is inevitably fallible. Did this dislodging of God's revealed word from the Bible as a text to human reason as the interpreter of the text also help to spark the growth of conscience as an internal human trait? In short, and this is my final question before I go rushing off to the Townsend duties, to what extent must we recover a robustly non-political origin for our ideas of conscience and toleration, given how importantly political those two ideas ultimately became in America? Thank you.
I'm just going to take questions, call on people from here. We have until 11:30 to get a discussion going, at which point we'll break briefly and then reconvene at 11:45. So, questions for Professors Murphy or Valeri?
Yeah, I wonder, thank you for your talk. I wonder if, I want to invoke Edward Said's concept of affiliation in his essay, Secular Criticism, and sort of maybe have you speak about this notion of the secular and the religious, whether it's an incomplete process or not. Maybe it is simply the process of indoctrination of systems into what becomes an affiliative process, and thus almost petrified in its against its own progress. If that makes any sense.
Well, the term that I actually used, I'm never quite sure what secular means, or secularization, or secularizing, or secularism. So the term that I used was subjectification of conscience, by which I meant to refer to an increasing, and actually Caroline has left, so she can't defend herself or make this connection. But I actually think she's entirely right that this religious to secular narrative is not helpful, but actually the movement of religious modes to other areas of life and in different languages, perhaps. So the sort of subjectification of conscience that I was talking about leaves intact a whole sort of theological structure about what it means to be right or wrong on any given issue, and sort of alongside it places this other aspect of the tradition, which is the necessity for one to come to assent to various principles. And then sort of, because my own particular focus is more political, it gets to the question of what's the political implication, or what's the political way in which one argues that one ought to be, in the early modern context, left alone, or in our own context, arguments for various types of liberation. And these become very, as I mentioned with Penn, they become very mundane in a way. As he says, I premise all of my liberatory rhetoric about the conscience, always on the presumption that you are a good neighbor, a good child, a good citizen. And those are deeply religious sort of understandings that he's got. So I'm not sure that I'm speaking to your question, which is that, I'm guilty. So I guess that I tend to stay away from the secular language unless it's either a language that's invoked by the primary sources I'm dealing with, which in the historical period we're dealing with, you don't generally get that kind of language, or unless there's sort of a very particular kind of referent that I'm sure about. So I'm less comfortable with the language. I think much of the Talal Asad and Said and others, I think they're right on that these things don't describe fundamentally different sets, but they're actually very political in the way in which they're deployed, which is part of the reason why I tend to shy away from using them unless I'm very clear about what I'm trying to get at. That may not be an answer to your question, but it's a start.
Mark, I just want to say that it's really, the question is about that movement, again, using different terminology, from the filiative to the affiliative. And, it's...
Could you explain that more for me?
I mean, the filiative is something that is what we, in a sense, to use his expression, what we consider religious or something innate. And the affiliative is when you move towards something that it becomes part of a process, a system, and then you get stuck in it, actually, which is a problem as well.
I see there.
I'm not so sure, for instance, that being a good neighbor is religious, Well,
all I meant was that the reigning understandings of what it meant to be a good neighbor at the time that this was invoked by Penn were themselves deeply rooted in that kind of language. That's all. Yeah.
What you say evokes to me Charles Taylor's A Secular Age, in which Taylor says secularism or secular thought can be seen in one of three ways. Maybe we should be clear on how we're using the term. It's sort of a political term, meaning the divorce of political or public decisions from explicit secular rationales. So it can be a political term.
Explicit religious rationales.
Yes, religious rationales. Thank you very much. With an implied toleration of different religious perspectives. Second, he says, is a philosophical term, which means sort of taking religious belief less seriously, voiding explanations for causation in the world of theological content, naturalism, etc. And he says, but the more helpful way to think of secularism is as a kind of collection of cultural assumptions emerging in the 16th, 17th centuries that are focused on two things. And I'm going to come back around to your point. The two things meaning, one, that human happiness or human well-being is implicitly the chief end or goal of moral action and reform. Interesting, right? That human happiness or well-being is assumed in a secular era to be the chief end or purpose of moral action, as opposed to the glory of God, something that sort of transcends or is beyond human well-being. And he says the second part of this is that this is not, secularism means that religious belief is not coerced by society. That doesn't mean it's less religious. So he says that you can have India, secular political society, highly religious, the United States, secular society, highly religious, but not coerced on the same front. Now to come back around. Embedded in Taylor's analysis is the fear. I don't know the Said work you talk about, but embedded in this is the fear Taylor sort of brings out that when human happiness or reform becomes the chief tacit goal and assumption of moral action, it becomes institutionalized as a program. Is that getting at it? So that secularization in those terms then valorizes human programs of reform, which is dangerous in Taylor's view, because any human programs for reform become sort of self-perpetuating, rather than what's funny about this religion thing is it's kind of oppressive to have God dictating rules, but the sort of good side of it might be that if there's this God thing out there dictating rules, you won't think that your own program is divine in and of itself. Does that come close?
Sure, yeah.
Please, after you.
That might be a mistake. It's an honor to be in the presence of scholars and have a chance to ask questions. And so if I had any shred of discretion, I probably wouldn't ask this, but my curiosity gets me. As an intelligence officer, as I introduced myself, one thing that I'm often aware of is, are we asking the right question? Because we can come up with an excellent answer, but if we start with the wrong question, the answer itself is going to be wrong. So I'm wondering, instead of talking about the secularization of consciousness, of conscience, I have to wonder, and like it says here, from religious burden to natural right. Maybe it was a natural right that became a religious burden. I mean, even in the context of the pre-revolutionary period that you addressed, perhaps not. But I'm even thinking about people who lived in extreme places where their source for conscience ultimately came from themselves or their families or their communities, and not necessarily a religious source. So I'm hearing from the presentations, and correct me if I'm wrong, that conscience seems to be vested in some religious authority, and somehow over time it evolved to maybe the secular community picked it up. And I'm not sure that I'm convinced by that argument.
Do you mean you're not convinced in the historical argument? You're saying there was not this shift from the 17th to 18th centuries, or you're saying you do not see how that plays out in contemporary societies?
The latter.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah, I wouldn't deem to challenge you on
Okay.
that.
Well, I think that in some ways that's the question that we're going to be hearing about in a number of different ways, is and I think that we heard from Caroline as well. I mean, there's a sense in which the term conscience comes to mean a lot of things that it didn't mean in earlier times. And I guess the question is whether, I mean, on the one hand, it's clearly the case that we're not talking about the same thing, say now, than people were 300 years ago. But yet there is this term invoked, and the term has been consistently invoked. And so what might we be able to say about what it is that's being invoked over the course of time that goes by this name of conscience? Clearly, this is on the one, there's two ways you might look at this. One is for example, say David Richards, a legal scholar who takes from the arguments about liberty of conscience expansive understandings, same-sex marriage, racial equality, gender equality, all from arguments that from our perspective look rather stunted and rather highly Christian and fairly narrow. And yet Richard's argument is that sort of unpacking the resources of the argument may lead you to a place very different from the place occupied by those who first invoked the term. Now, I guess what I would just suggest, and if I'm missing the question or if I'm not answering, I mean, please repose it. I guess my worry is not so much about whether we're missing the question or whether it's the wrong way around, but rather what might we learn or what might we say about the fact that this particular term seems to have this kind of powerful resonance for us, even in places that are far removed, in domains that are far removed from the fairly minimum. I mean, the 17th century tolerationist argument was simply an argument to be left alone. Stop fining me, stop throwing me in jail because of my doctrine. It's even within Protestants, and most of them didn't even want Catholics to be tolerated. So it's from a half glass full, glass half empty. But there has sort of over time continued to be this power in this term conscience, and what might that tell us about the work that the term or the concept does for us, even in very different times and places. I'm not sure if that's...
No, let me add to that. So I think the value of historical study in such terms is to expose the logic of different options. It is to explain where we have come from historically, and therefore to explain the way we think in ways we do not often articulate. But it also is to expose the logic of different options so that in different contexts, when you see people, and I do not think secularization is the right and dominant story. That was part of my paper, was trying to apply there are religious reasons and changing religious views that push this story along, not secularization, except for maybe in Taylor's sense of a broad sort of program of reform. So I think that what one should do from such studies in applying them to contemporary cultures is understand where the American social conscience, what helps explain it, and B, when you encounter different cultural situations, to sort of probe the logic of connections between religion, conscience, moral behavior, and try to use these kinds of historical studies to see how things are connected. I was not making claim about the modern world as a whole.